The gospel of Jesus Christ was the foundation of Dad's life, and he took every opportunity to teach and reinforce its principles in our lives.
She was a true follower of Christ. She was. She embodied the attributes of Christ on a daily basis.
And they were really dedicated to living the gospel. And one of the main things he wanted us to remember is the worth of the individual and how important it was that we never forget that, and how vital it was that we knew the value of each person.
My mother had a faith in God and taught us to pray. We always had family prayer, kneeling around the kitchen table before we ate.
And I remember we'd have family prayer around the yellow Formica table. We'd each have our chairs, and we'd each kneel in our chairs, and we'd have family prayer every single morning without fail. Nighttime we did sometimes. Older, when I came back and visited Mom and Dad, we'd always have family prayer together. But I think as kids, the big time was to have it in the morning. And what I remember is that Mother and Dad would always pray for us and about us while we were there, kneeling at our chairs. And, bless Doug, maybe he might have a test that day, or, Marcelly, because she was away, for some reason, or Helen Mar or me for some reason. And it was always that. And so we just did that as we grew up. It became very normal to pray for each other.
They both relied on prayer a lot.
We had regular family prayer. We had family home evening before there was a family home evening manual. It was part of what they had just decided in their lives that they would do. And I don't know that we do it faithfully every week, but quite often we did. Enough so that I have very distinct memories of doing it.
When I was very little, Mother and Dad must have really taught us a lot, because I understood many things about the gospel. When I think back now, more than at the time, I just thought, well, my parents had taught me, but they really taught me how to understand the Spirit and how to live so that I could heed it. And they taught me to be obedient. I knew it was important to obey. And Dad taught us about how all the little blessings are predicated upon laws, and we learned to say that scripture and learned how to use the big words, and we were feeling very proud of ourselves. But when I was little, I knew that it was important to obey.
And taught me in everyday living how to be Christ-like. She really did.
She was always helping others, picking up a widow to take to church, taking vegetables and fruits to the neighbors.
And so when you talk about loving the Lord and loving your fellow man, that's what they did.
I remember going with my mother to visit Sister Wagner. Sister Wagner was an immigrant from Germany who was very elderly and very independent, and my mother just adored her and was so good to her. I remember my mother coming home one day and saying, "Sister Wagner's up in her cherry tree trimming the tree." 90-year-old woman up in the tree trimming the cherry tree, and so my mom got her some help, and my dad. I remember my mother said that my dad had a little group of alcoholics, and he did. He had this little group, and it was always kind of expanding and changing, but he had a group of men who he regularly kept in touch with because they needed his friendship and love and faith and prayers, and he home taught Dan, and he would take us with him to go see Dan. And I remember walking in the room and thinking, I can't see his face because the smoke is so thick. But my dad regularly home taught him and visited him, and I'm sure they gave him to Dad to home teach because nobody else, first of all, he probably wouldn't let anybody else in. Secondly, nobody else wanted to go visit him, and my dad just loved him, and he knew that my dad loved him.
And I remember them telling stories of how much they loved him and how responsive they were to him, a lot of times just through his faithfulness as a home teacher. The church was a big part of my parents' lives. And I have very distinct memories of listening to General Conference around the radio. We didn't have a television.
We had a big brown radio. It was a big piece of furniture. Do you remember that big brown radio? Yeah. I remember sitting on the floor around the radio and in our pajamas listening to conference, and I remember cutting out little things for your election at school while we were listening to conference. We would listen all day Saturday and all day Sunday.
I remember going with my dad to have very fond memories of going to the Tabernacle in Ogden at conference time to the priesthood session and sitting with him in the priesthood session. I remember feeling the Spirit in those sessions as a young boy when I was a young deacon and teacher going with him.
I remember coming home from school and my mother ironing and listening to conference. And that was back when conference was Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. She always listened to it while she was ironing.
Very positive. I remember him saying that he had never served a mission as a young man. I was always raised with the idea from the time I was young that I would serve a mission. It was never any question about it. I guess it's another example of how committed they were to the gospel. There was just never any debate about it. I was prepared from the time I was young, given my own scriptures, and just talked as if I would be going on a mission, which is kind of interesting because my parents didn't grow up in families where their siblings went on missions. And my grandfather, my father's father, had served a mission in the eastern states, but my father didn't serve a mission, and the reason he didn't is because the oldest son, my Uncle John, served a mission and my dad supported him. So my dad stayed home and worked, and the money that he made supported my uncle on his mission. And by the time it was time for my dad to serve a mission, he was doing other things, I guess, in his life, and didn't do it.
He tried always to be obedient to the commandments and the words of the prophet. For example, once he and my mother attended a meeting where they were admonished not to play cards because they encouraged gambling excuse me, and were a waste of time. He and my mother came home, and they used to play canasta with all of their friends. They came home and got rid of all of their decks of cards. That had an impression on me as a child.
When I was growing up, church wasn't in a block of time. So Sunday mornings we would go to priesthood meeting early, and then Sunday school, and then we would go home for lunch and in the afternoon, and then come back in the later in the afternoon and have sacrament meeting. That's how it was divided up.
Because we lived only about a mile from the church, we lived close enough that we were always over there for something. There was always, Mom was taking a casserole for some activity, or we were over there waiting for Dad to finish a meeting, and we'd come home with him. We spent a lot of time at the church building.
I remember the adjustment of moving into our ward, even though I would have been 5 years old or 5 or 6 years old at the time. And the immediate years following that, there was a time when a sister in the ward was quite mean to my mother, I think out of jealousy. That was my take on it. But I remember my mother struggling hard with that for a long time, because no matter what she did, she could not overcome the jealousy and could not get that woman to soften toward her. And I remember my dad being patient with her and loving her through that. And I'm not sure it was ever really resolved. I think my mother had to just make peace on her own with herself, because the woman never changed. That was a fascinating trial that I still recall and sometimes have even thought about as an adult, and sometimes reflected on when we've run into people that we've had difficult times with ourselves as adults. They were very active in our ward. We were just expected to attend church every week.
But my parents' view of church service was not just accept and serve in the callings you're given. It was serve, period. And so they were extremely diligent home teachers and visiting teachers.
She served faithfully in the church all her life.
My mom probably had every calling you can think of in every organization at one time or another. I remember being small enough that I fit under the bench, under the pew at church, and I remember playing under the pew while my mom had a Relief Society meeting on the bench above me. I remember my mother being in the primary presidency. She was a primary teacher. I think she was the reason I got my first calling. When I was 12 years old, I was the primary organist. And she got me involved in that. That was a great blessing. She was in Cub Scouts for all the years that my brother was in Cub Scouts. She was a den leader. She served with all her heart. When she was the gospel doctrine teacher, she was so concerned about that calling. And she was a fabulous teacher, but she would spend all week long studying and so that she could teach 10 hours worth of material, and she would teach 1 hour worth of material. I mean, she was very dedicated at every calling that she ever had.
All his life, he worked and served in the church. He was a bishop, a temple worker, a faithful home teacher, and a 70 back when 70s were the ward missionaries.
I remember when he was sustained, the day that he was sustained to be the bishop. He called us all around the dining room table. And back then, church, you would go to priesthood in the morning, then men would come home, pick up all their families, come back, go to Sunday school, then you come home, have lunch, then you'd go back to sacrament meeting at 4, 5, 6 o'clock in the evening. So we were having lunch on a Sunday, and he called us all around the dining room table after we'd all eaten, and he said, I have something really important to tell you, and I waited to tell you now because you can't tell anybody, because I'm going to be sustained as the bishop in sacrament meeting today, and I want to know if you can sustain me. And then he went on to explain what sustaining him really meant, that we had to honor his his being bishop, and we had to do our best to come to meetings and to live the gospel, and to, he kind of outlined what when we raised our hands, that meant that we were going to sustain the bishop, that we were going to support the bishop and do what he wanted us to do. And it was a whole new concept to me because I was 8. I was young. I was 7. I was not yet 8, because when I turned 8, he was the bishop when he baptized me. But I just remembered that the concept of, oh, that's what sustaining means. And then we went to church, and Jeannie and I were sitting next to each other, and Zelpha Crawford came and sat down next to Jeannie and kind of elbowed her, and she said, I think that they ought to call your father to be the bishop. And Jeannie just smiled and didn't say anything. And then when they did, she looked over at Jeannie, like, why didn't you tell me that you do? Their callings in the church, they gave their whole selves to. And my dad definitely gave his whole self to being bishop. I mean, his every waking and probably every sleeping hour was spent thinking about serving or serving. When he was bishop, people came to our home. Now I just think it's the way the world is and the way the policy is in the church. People come to the office to the bishop's office. But our living room was the bishop's office, in addition to the one he had at the church. But almost daily, somebody was in the living room talking to Dad. And if the door was shut, you knew that Dad was doing church business in the living room, and you didn't go in there and you didn't disturb him. And I remember when his counselors would leave on vacation and he'd be left to run the ward on his own, and there was a little boy up the street who always would come and help my dad in the yard. Cute little kid. He was just tiny, but he always called him Bishop Rick, just because he thought that was his name. His name was Bishop Rick, and my dad, Bishop Rick, But my dad said, yeah, I am the whole Bishop Rick, because everybody went on vacation, and here I am. He had a very demanding calling as bishop.
if I remember correctly, through my Aaronic priesthood years, he was a bishop. And just as I was graduating from high school, or when I left home, I think is when he changed. I remember my dad being a very faithful bishop and a very faithful home teacher, and him helping a lot of the less active members of our ward to some degree get activated again. And I remember the less active, him helping the less active, and those who may have not been on the same socioeconomic level as some of the other ward members, or as he and my mom were. And the great love that these people had for him. My dad was very empathetic.
He was very compassionate and empathetic with the widows in the ward. We had a lot of older widows who he did a lot of things to help. And he had people, it was easy for people to trust him. He was very compassionate and very giving. I cannot even tell you the number of missionaries who he supported. Most of the time, the family never knew. Some of them we found out about later. Some of them we knew but he was always helping somebody go on a mission who couldn't afford to. But suddenly they could afford to, and we never found out how, and it was because Dad was helping him. The bishop doesn't have time to spend hours and hours and hours just listening to someone who just needs to talk. They don't really need the bishop's help with anything specific. They just need to have a listener, and then maybe they don't have a home teacher that's listening, and so my mother was always there, and there were several people who regularly would call and couldn't catch the bishop at home, but they could always catch my mom. And I remember my mom on the phone just listening with several people, and the phone was always ringing, always. In fact, we got to the point where we would take it off the hook during dinner, just so we could have dinner without the phone interrupting us. But the phone was always for the bishop, and it was always ringing. My dad was called when I was 8, and he was released when I was 16. So all of those growing up years, I just remember the phone constantly ringing. When he was made bishop, the building needed to be remodeled, and a lot of the years that he was bishop were spent in accomplishing that, getting the support of the members of the ward. Back then, you had to earn your own money to remodel the building. It didn't come out of tithing funds. And he had several ward members who were quite vocal about what they thought ought to happen, and they were not the plans that the church had approved. And I remember him.
I don't remember any of the details because I was off at college, but I do remember that it was hard.
I remember him coming home from a meeting where one of the former bishops had gotten up and proposed a different plan for the remodeling than Dad had proposed. And he was very vocal and negative about Dad's plan. And Dad just said, this is a very impractical idea, but he didn't say that to the man. He let him talk, and he was very considerate of everybody's opinion. But then he had to deal with the fact that the church had approved this other plan, and they needed to stick it with it. I mean, he was a real peacemaker. It could have been a source of contention in the ward, and it ended up that everybody ended up supporting him in the end, and he really brought peace to the project and got it done. But I remember him being very, very pressured by the expense of it and by the work of it, and I remember helping scrub and paint, and everybody in the ward was over there.
I was working the day that we went to meet John at the airport, coming home from his mission. In the morning, I was over working at the church.
At the church.
I can't remember what I was doing, but I remember that.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember when the remodeling was completed, it was just such a relief to Dad.
Of course, my dad was bishop, so my mom was a bishop's wife, so she knew everybody and served everybody. But I think mostly they were involved in our lives. I mean, it's true, that was the primary thing, though they did participate in those other things. Wouldn't you say that that was true?
Oh, we were always first priority.
Yeah.
Dad would read to us his seminary books, and I really learned to love the scriptures. We learned to read those, and he taught us to sing the books of the Bible. That was such a help to be able to find where they were.
She loved to study the scriptures and would often mail us uplifting thoughts and enrichment materials that she had read. I remember her sharing Relief Society lessons and sacrament talks that had inspired her. I think she really enjoyed her mission because she was able to delve into the scriptures. She had more time and could do that with more depth than she ever had. And I think she really was stimulated and enjoyed that.
And always, they had a lot of hardships in their lives. But I don't know that they would have talked about that because they had a lot of joy. But I think they each had a lot of hard things to deal with, and I think they felt great blessings and great joy in their lives, but they relied on the Lord.